Scientists just tried to test King Solomon's DNA. And what happened next is stranger than any discovery, because after 30 years of digging under Jerusalem, after finding gold seals, ancient walls, and inscriptions that mention his name, there is still no body, no bones, no tomb, no DNA to test. And that single missing fact might be the biggest clue of all. For 3,000 years, King Solomon has been remembered as the wisest man who ever lived. A king with more gold than he could count, a temple built from cedar and stone, and a mind so sharp that even a queen from a foreign land crossed a desert just to test him with riddles. But here is the strange part. While kings before him and after him left behind tombs, bones, and burial chambers that we can study today, Solomon left behind almost nothing physical at all. No confirmed grave, no skeleton, no royal seal with his name carved into it that scientists all agree is real. Just stories, a few scattered clues in the dirt, and a debate among historians that has never really ended. Then came Jerusalem itself. For decades, one of the biggest arguments among historians was simple. Did Jerusalem in Solomon's time even look like a real capital city? Or was it just a small village that later writers exaggerated into a golden empire? This question mattered because if Jerusalem was tiny and poor in the 10th century before Christ, then the whole story of a wealthy, powerful Solomon starts to fall apart. That is when archaeologist Eilat Mazar entered the picture. She spent years digging in the area known as the Ophel, right next to the Temple Mount, and what her team uncovered changed the conversation. They found a massive stone wall, more than 200 feet long and about 20 feet high, built as part of a defensive system that included a gatehouse, a guard tower, and an administrative building. The pottery found near the wall dated to the same century Solomon is said to have ruled. Mazar herself believed this wall matched a passage in the biblical book of Kings that describes Solomon building the walls of Jerusalem. Other archaeologists were not so quick to agree. Some, like Israel Finkelstein, argued the dating could be pushed later into a different century entirely. And that argument is still going on today, with new academic papers being published on both sides, even now. But here is what almost nobody disputes. Something big was built in Jerusalem around that time, something that required serious labor, serious planning, and serious resources. The only real question is whose name belongs on it. While that debate continued in Jerusalem, another discovery was quietly reshaping the picture from a completely different direction. Down in the Negev desert, at a small site called Khirbet Sumili, archaeologists digging through the dirt found something surprisingly small but surprisingly powerful. Tiny clay seals known as bulli. These little lumps of hardened clay were once pressed onto documents and packages to show they came from an official source, almost like an ancient version of a wax seal on a royal letter. Finding these seals in this location, dated to the 10th century before Christ, told researchers something important. There was organized government activity happening in this region at exactly the time many scholars had claimed no kingdom could possibly exist yet. You cannot have official seals without an official government sending official messages. Suddenly, the idea of an early, organized kingdom in the time of David and Solomon looked a lot more believable. Then, hundreds of miles south, in a scorching valley called Timna, another piece of the puzzle turned up in the last place anyone expected, inside old copper mines. For a long time, historians assumed these ancient copper mining operations belonged to the Egyptians. But newer excavations and advanced dating techniques told a different story. The mining activity at Timna matched the same century as Solomon's reign, and it showed signs of a highly organized operation, one capable of managing labor, resources, and trade on a large scale. This lines up strikingly well with biblical descriptions of Solomon's wealth, coming partly from mining and trade routes, stretching far beyond his own borders. It does not prove Solomon personally owned these mines, but it proves that a kingdom capable of running something like this existed in that region at that exact moment in history. Before we get to the next piece of evidence, it helps to remember why Solomon became so famous in the first place, because his reputation was never really about armies or conquest. It was about judgment. One of the most repeated stories about him involves two women who came to him arguing over a baby, each claiming to be the real mother. With no witnesses and no way to prove either side, Solomon offered a strange solution: cut the child in half and give each woman one part. One woman agreed. The other begged him to give the baby to her rival instead, unable to bear the thought of the child being harmed. That reaction told Solomon everything he needed to know, because a real mother would rather lose her child to someone else than see it hurt. He gave the baby to the woman who begged for its life. It is a simple story, but it's spread across the ancient world as proof that this king could see straight through to the truth of a situation, even when the facts alone could not prove it. Stories like this traveled fast, and according to ancient accounts, they eventually reached a queen from a distant land, ruler of a kingdom associated with incense, spices, and gold. She is remembered as the Queen of Sheba, and the story says she refused to simply believe the rumors about Solomon's wisdom. She loaded caravans with gold, rare spices, and precious stones, and made the long journey herself, arriving with a list of difficult riddles designed to test him. According to the account, Solomon answered every single one, and by the time she left, she admitted that even the stories she had heard had not come close to the reality of what she witnessed. For a long time, this entire episode was treated by many historians as a beautiful legend with no real historical weight behind it, mainly because there was no solid evidence connecting ancient Israel to the region associated with Sheba. Solomon's kingdom was also remembered as unusually wealthy for its size, and the Bible credits much of that wealth to trade rather than conquest. Ships are described sailing out to a distant land called Ophir and returning loaded with gold, along with more unusual cargo like ivory and rare animals. Historians still debate exactly where Ophir was located, with theories ranging from the Arabian Peninsula to parts of East Africa or even India. But the underlying claim that Solomon's kingdom ran long-distance trade networks bringing in serious wealth fits surprisingly well with what archaeologists have found at sites like the Timna copper mines, where evidence points to organized large-scale mining and trade operations happening at exactly the right time. There's another layer to Solomon's legacy that rarely gets mentioned in these documentary-style videos, and it has nothing to do with gold or temples at all. Several books in the Bible, including Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, are traditionally credited to Solomon, remembered not just as a builder and a ruler, but as a writer and a thinker who put his reflections on wisdom, human nature, and the meaning of life into words that are still read today. Scholars disagree about how much of this material was actually written by Solomon himself versus compiled or expanded by later generations who wrote in his name, a common practice in the ancient world when honoring a respected figure. But regardless of who held the pen, the fact that an entire literary tradition attached itself to this one king across multiple books, multiple centuries, and multiple religious traditions says something about how deeply his reputation for wisdom took root in the ancient imagination. Now here is where the story gets even more interesting, because in January of this year, a piece of research quietly dropped that reignited one of the oldest legends connected to Solomon, the story of the Queen of Sheba. According to ancient texts, a queen from a distant land heard about Solomon's wisdom and traveled a great distance just to test him with hard questions, bringing gold, spices, and gifts with her. For a long time, this story was treated as pure folklore, a beautiful tale with no real historical backbone, mostly because there was no solid evidence connecting ancient Israel to the region historians associate with Sheba, believed to be located in what is now Yemen. But a small inscription discovered years earlier during excavations at the Ophel in Jerusalem has recently been re-examined by a researcher who believes it is written not in the local Canaanite script, as everyone originally assumed, but in an ancient South Arabian script known as Sabaeik, the very language connected to the kingdom of Sheba itself. If that reading is correct, it would be the first physical evidence ever found connecting Solomon's Jerusalem directly to the region of Sheba, sitting just a few hundred yards from where the temple is believed to have stood. It is a small object, just 7 letters carved into stone, but if the interpretation holds up, it could be one of the most important discoveries connected to Solomon's story in decades. Not proof that the queen herself ever set foot in Jerusalem, but real evidence that trade and contact between these two distant regions was happening exactly when the story says it did. There's also a place in Jerusalem historically called the Tomb of the Kings, a burial site that medieval travelers once genuinely believed held the remains of David and Solomon. It has recently been fully restored and opened to the public after years of renovation. But modern archaeology has confirmed this tomb was actually built centuries after Solomon's time, meaning whoever those original travelers were honoring, it almost certainly was not the biblical king himself. It is a perfect example of how legends can attach themselves to a location for hundreds of years before science eventually corrects the record. So if there is no tomb and no DNA, what would it even mean to test Solomon's DNA in the first place? This is where modern science actually does something remarkable, just not in the way viral videos often claim. Researchers today can extract ancient DNA from very old skeletal remains when they are properly preserved. And this technique has already reshaped what we know about entire ancient populations connected to the biblical world. Scientists have successfully studied ancient DNA from populations linked to the Philistines, the same people described as enemies of Israel in the Bible, and found genetic evidence suggesting a migration into the region from around the Aegean area, matching the biblical description of them as outsiders who arrived by sea. Similar work has been done studying ancient Canaanite populations, revealing detailed information about ancestry, migration, and how different groups in the ancient Near East were connected to each other, or in some cases, more distinct than expected. This kind of science is real, it is happening now, and it is genuinely rewriting parts of ancient history. But there is a very important difference between this kind of research and testing the DNA of one specific named individual from 3,000 years ago. To test Solomon's actual DNA, scientists would need confirmed remains that can be reliably identified as his, not just any old bones found somewhere in Jerusalem. Given how many layers of history sit on top of each other in that city, and given how much of the ground connected to Solomon's reign remains either undug or off limits, that kind of confirmed discovery has simply never happened. Anyone claiming otherwise online is either mistaken or telling you something that is not true. It also helps to understand just how physically difficult it would be to dig for a tomb in this particular part of the world, even if researchers knew exactly where to look. The ground beneath Jerusalem is not simple soil sitting over bedrock. It is layer after layer of collapsed buildings, ash from fires that destroyed the city multiple times throughout history, and construction material from at least a dozen different civilizations that ruled the area at different points. Archaeologists working in this kind of environment often compare it to reading a book where every page has been torn apart and mixed together with pages from several other books, then buried and left to sit for 3,000 years. Add in the fact that much of the most historically important ground, especially anywhere close to the Temple Mount, is considered sacred by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities alike, and any excavation there has to be handled with extraordinary care and diplomatic sensitivity, not just archaeological skill. This is not a case of scientists being lazy or uninterested. It is one of the most legally, politically, and religiously complicated excavation environments anywhere on the planet. And that brings us back to the real question worth asking. If we found solid proof tomorrow, a genuine burial chamber, confirmed remains, and DNA evidence linking directly to Solomon's bloodline, what would it actually tell us? It could tell us about his ancestry, his health, possibly even hint at his physical appearance. But here's the thing people often miss. It would not tell us whether he was truly wise. It would not explain how a small kingdom in a rocky, difficult landscape managed to become wealthy enough to build a temple. People are still talking about thousands of years later. It would not explain how his name ended up woven into 3 of the world's major religions, remembered as a builder, a poet, a ruler, and a symbol of wisdom across cultures that otherwise disagree about almost everything else. DNA can tell you where someone came from. It cannot tell you what they built, what they wrote, or why their name outlived their body by 3,000 years. And maybe that is the real twist in this story. We keep searching for Solomon's bones because we assume that is where the truth is hiding. But every real discovery so far, the wall in Jerusalem, the seals in the desert, the copper mines in Timna, the inscription connecting Jerusalem to Sheba, none of these came from a tomb. They came from the ground level of ordinary life, from walls people built, seals people stamped, mines people worked, and trade people carried out. The evidence for Solomon has never been about finding his body. It has been about finding the fingerprints of the kingdom he built. So no, scientists have not tested King Solomon's DNA. And as of right now, in 2026, there's nothing confirmed to test it on. But that does not mean the mystery is over. New excavations are happening in Jerusalem this very year. New inscriptions are still being re-examined with better technology than what was available even a decade ago. Every few years, another small piece turns up, a wall, a seal, a scrap of ancient writing, that pushes the debate a little further and forces skeptics to take the story a little more seriously. Somewhere under the layers of Jerusalem in ground that has been built on and destroyed and rebuilt more times than almost any city on earth, there may still be answers waiting. Whether Solomon's actual remains will ever be found, nobody can say for certain. But if there is one thing 3,000 years of searching has proven, it is that this story refuses to stay buried. Every time historians think they have reached a dead end, the ground gives up one more clue. So maybe the real question is not whether we will ever find Solomon's DNA. Maybe the real question is what we will find next, and whether we are ready for what it might tell us about a king who has been dead for 3,000 years, but somehow still refuses to be forgotten. If you found this as fascinating as I did, let me know down in the comments what you think really happened to Solomon's remains. And make sure you are subscribed, because the excavations under Jerusalem are still active right now, and the next discovery could drop at any time.